This is a tutorial on trinomial factoring. When we factor a second degree trinomial with a leading coefficient of 1, that's the same as multiplying two binomials in reverse. Remember, if I have x plus a times x plus b, and I wanted to multiply those together, I would FOIL, or take everything in the first binomial and multiply it by everything in the second binomial. So I would take x times x and end up with x squared. I would multiply a times x and end up with ax. Next, I would take x times b and end up with bx. And then lastly, a times b and end up with ab. If I combine my like terms, I'd end up with x squared plus a plus b times x plus a times b. Now if I wanted to do this for real, or with numbers, if I say I had x plus 1 times x plus 2, I would take x times x and end up with x squared. I would take 1 times x and end up with 1x. X times 2, end up with 2x. And then 1 times 2, end up with 1 times 2. Now if we simplified this, we'd end up with x squared plus 3x plus 2. The idea of trinomial factoring is to take this form here and bring it back to its factored form that looks like that. So say I had the trinomial x squared minus 2x minus 24, and I wanted to factor that. Well, let's think about what's going on here. If we have two factors, x plus a and x plus b, then our trinomial, the constant term, is going to be those two numbers multiplied together. So we're going to need two numbers that multiply together to get us negative 24. And those same numbers, when added together, have to give us negative 2. Well, the way to do this is to come up with all the numbers that can multiply together to get negative 24. I can get negative 24 from negative 1 times 24. I can also get it from positive 1 times negative 24. I can do it with 2 and negative 12, negative 2 and positive 12, negative 3 and 8, or positive 3 and negative 8. I can also get it from a negative 4 and a positive 6, or 4 and a negative 6. These are all the different ways I can take two numbers, say a and b, multiply them together, and get negative 24. Now the question is, which sets of these numbers will add together to get us negative 2? Well, if I take negative 1 and a positive 24 and I add them together, I'll get a positive 23. If I take a positive 1 and a negative 24 and I add them together, I'll get a negative 23. 2 and negative 12 added together is negative 10. Negative 2 and positive 12 added together is positive 10. Negative 3 and positive 8 would be a positive 5. 3 and a negative 8 is a negative 5. Negative 4 and 6 would be a positive 2, and 4 and negative 6 would be a negative 2. Well, I'm looking for a negative 2, and the only set that get us that is a positive 4 and a negative 6. So we can call positive 4a and negative 6b. So my factors then would be x plus 4 and x minus 6. Now if we wanted to check our work, we could go ahead and FOIL that. We'd have x times x, which is x squared, 4 times x, which would be 4x, x times negative 6 would be minus 6x, and then 4 times negative 6, or 4 times negative 6. X squared is x squared. 4x minus 6x would be minus 2x. And then 4 times a negative 6 would be a minus 24. Well, this is what we were looking for. So our factors are indeed x plus 4 times x minus 6. When we're factoring trinomials, there's some hints that we can use to help us figure out what numbers multiply together to get our constant term and what numbers add together to get us our linear term coefficient. If we have a trinomial and our constant term c is greater than 0, which means this 20 is positive, well, the only way you can get a positive number when you multiply two numbers together is to multiply two positive numbers or two negative numbers. If you ever multiply a positive and a negative, you'll end up with a negative number. So the fact that our constant term here, 20, is positive, that means we need to have two positive numbers or two negative numbers multiplied together to get us a positive 20. Now if we go to our linear coefficient here of 9, this is a positive 9. And since we're adding two numbers together, that means that since this is positive, we're not going to use any negative numbers to get our positive 20. So this will restrict or eliminate several of the possible ways that you could get 20. So if we thought of all the different ways of two numbers can multiply together to get 20, we could do 1 and 20. Now you could also do negative 1 and negative 20, but there's no way two negative numbers will add together to be a positive 9. So we just forget about those. So other ways we can get a positive 20 would be 2 and 10, 4 and 5. And that's only ways that we can get a positive 20 and a positive 9. Now which of these add together to get positive 9? Well, it's this 4 and 5 right here. So our factors are 4 and 5. So this will factor down into x plus 4 and x plus 5. Let's try this again. Here we have a negative 5 and a positive 6. Now our c, or our constant term, is positive, and the only way we can get a positive constant term is if we multiply two positive numbers or two negative numbers. The coefficient in our linear term is a negative 5, and there's no way I can add two positive numbers and get a negative number. So the numbers that we're going to use to get a positive 6 are all going to be negative. So it's going to be a negative 1 or a negative 6, or a negative 2 and a negative 3. Those are the only ways I can use negative numbers and get a positive 6. Now which of these add together to be a negative 5? Well, it's this negative 2 and negative 3. So my functions then are going to be x minus 2 and x minus 3. This is the factored form of x squared minus 5x plus 6. So with a little bit of inspection, you can eliminate several of the combinations of multiples of your constant term. Now let's see what's going on when we have a negative constant value. Here I have x squared plus 1x minus 12. Now the only way I can multiply two numbers together and get a negative number is if I multiply a positive and a negative number. And I need these numbers to add together to be a positive 1. So let's think of all the ways I can multiply a negative 12. I can use a negative 1 and a positive 12, a 1 and a negative 12, a 2 and a negative 6, negative 2 and positive 6, negative 3 and 4, and 3 and negative 4. The coefficient of our linear term here is a positive 1. Now if this is positive and I'm adding two numbers together, that means that my larger number has to be positive. So this 1 and negative 12 I can tell right away is not going to work. This 2 and negative 6, not going to work. 3 and negative 4 also not going to work, because if I add any of these numbers together, I'm going to end up with a negative sum. So now that we've eliminated those, we need to figure out which one of them will add together to get us positive 1. And the answer is this 4 and negative 3. If I multiply negative 3 and 4, I'll get negative 12. And if I add negative 3 and 4, I get a positive 1. So my factors then are x minus 3 and x plus 4. Now let's try this again. Here we have x squared minus 3x minus 10. Now again, my constant term, c, is negative. And the only way I can get a negative number is by multiplying a positive and a negative number. So ways to get 10? Well, negative 1 and positive 10. 1 and negative 10. Negative 2 and 5. 2 and negative 5. Now the coefficient of my linear term is a -3, which means my larger number here has got to be negative because we're going to be adding them together and we want to end up with a negative number. So this one is not going to work. And this one is not going to work. So which of the two left over will add together to get us -3? And the answer is these last two. So our factors then are going to be x plus 2 and x minus 5. And that completes the tutorial on trinomial factoring.